One of my favorite verses surrounding the Christmas story. Do you remember when the wise men come to Jerusalem? That's a whole thing about. I might preach that message on the 21st. What to do when the star disappears. I'm praying about that, but they end up in Jerusalem. Talk to me this morning. Jesus was born where? Bethlehem. But they went to Jerusalem because they were looking for the king. And that's one of my favorite verses involving the Christmas story. They come and they say, "Where is the one who was born King of the Jews?" You know, people aren't typically born kings. They're typically born, if they're royalty, they're typically born a prince. Jesus is born the King of the Jews. But we know this, don't we? He's more than that. He is King of Kings, and He is Lord of Lords. And so what we're doing in the year 2025, what we've been doing since the month of February, really, is we have been learning how the gospel story that the Bible tells is really the story of how King Jesus enters into the kingdom of the world as a baby to grow in wisdom and stature as a man, to use the language of the Scriptures, so that King Jesus can invite citizens of the kingdom of the world into the kingdom of heaven. That's the big story of the Bible. God becomes flesh so that citizens of the kingdom of the world can become citizens of the kingdom of heaven. One of the things we learned early on in our study of the Sermon on the Mount is that there is an explicit way into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus has that familiar conversation with Nicodemus in John chapter 3, and He tells Nicodemus, if you want to enter into the kingdom of heaven, you must be born again. That's not old-timer language. That's not old-fashioned language. That's Bible language. Born again is the requirement for entering the kingdom of heaven. It is the way in which citizens of the kingdom of the world are translated into the kingdom of heaven. I would just pause right here long enough to ask you, do you know beyond any shadow of a doubt that you've been born again from above by the Spirit through faith in the Son? Do you know for sure? Do you know for sure? Man, if you can't say for certain beyond any shadow of a doubt, I know that I'm a child of God. Jesus is my Savior. Salvation is my present possession. Eternity with God awaits me when life on earth ends. If you can't make that claim this morning, and I pray today would be a snowy day in December 2025 could be the day where you could settle that for time and eternity. New birth is the way into the kingdom, but what we've been doing for the last, I think this is now our third week, what we've been doing is we've been studying the longest teaching recorded in Scripture of King Jesus. Please get this, it's so important. The longest recorded sermon of King Jesus on what life in the kingdom of heaven looks like. It's the big idea of the Sermon on the Mount. What does life in the kingdom of heaven look like? And of course, all of that is contained here for us in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 in what we've come to know as the Sermon on the Mount. We call it that because Jesus teaches this sermon on a mountain. So we're really creative with names. So we thought, Sermon on the Mount would be a great title for this sermon. A couple of weeks ago, I shared with you what theologians say is the crux issue, the main point of the Sermon on the Mount. It's in chapter number 5, verse number 20. You'll remember this, I'm sure. Jesus said, I say to you, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Scribes and Pharisees, of course, being the religious leaders of Jesus' day, and they were the holy people. They were the spiritual people. They were the righteous people in the eyes of the first century Jews. And so Jesus comes along and he says, unless your righteousness exceeds their righteousness, you'll not enter the kingdom of heaven. And what we talked about last week and maybe a little bit the week before is when Jesus makes this statement, he's not talking about our righteousness exceeding the amount of righteousness that the scribes. It's not like they did this many righteous deeds, and if you'll do one more, it's not the idea of our righteous deeds in an accumulative sense being more than the righteous deeds of the scribes and Pharisees. It's not the amount of righteousness, it's the kind of righteousness. The kind of righteousness. See, the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees was a kind of righteousness that fixated on the letter of the law, of God's law, the Old Testament. Their righteousness said, what does this law say? And then I'll just stick right to this law. But the righteousness possessed by citizens of the kingdom of heaven, hear me, it does not violate the law, but it's concerned with more than the letter of the law. The righteousness possessed by those in the kingdom of heaven is concerned with doing right by others. That's a big idea of the portion of this sermon that we're in. Jesus is telling us how citizens in the kingdom of heaven live in such a way that we do right by one another. And this is precisely what Jesus meant. Remember, if you don't remember or you've never even, sometimes we have people who come in, you say, I don't remember anything about the Bible, I don't know anything. Keep coming, we'll learn about the Bible together. There was this time where some people came to Jesus and they were trying to kind of trap him and see if they could get him to trip up. And I think I might have swallowed a bug, so I'm struggling with that. Just for a minute. Thank you. No, I don't need breakfast now. Praise the Lord. So there was this time where some people came to Jesus and they were trying to get him to trip up, and they said, what's the greatest law? Remember what Jesus said? Jesus said, Matthew chapter 22, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And they didn't ask him this, but he tagged it on there. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And so when we talk about the righteousness in the kingdom of heaven being a doing right by one another, we're talking about exactly what Jesus meant when he said, man, love God and love others, and this fulfills all the law. We got an example of, last Sunday, we got an example of what righteousness that exceeds the scribes and Pharisees looks like. I won't re-preach it, but I would just summarize it briefly to get our minds in gear. The scribes and Pharisees, they were really proud of themselves because they had never murdered anyone. And the law said, don't murder. And so they said, look how righteous we are. We've not killed anyone. But Jesus says, kingdom of heaven righteousness is not content with, well, I didn't murder them. Kingdom of heaven righteousness destroys the root of anger that would lead to the fruit of murder. Kingdom of heaven righteousness won't even speak unjustly angry words against another. Do you remember that? I've had some good conversations this week with people who have told me, now we can laugh a little bit about this, but I'm encouraged because I'm right in the same, like the Lord. I've had people who tell me, like, moron started to come to mind, and I thought, I'm not sure I'm going to say that today because of what the text says, right? So, and by the way, of course, kingdom of heaven righteousness is going to war against the root. Because it's out of the heart that words spring up anyways, right? Jesus said that. Jesus said out of the, I think it's right here, Jesus said, out of the abundance of his heart, the mouth speaks. And so if moron is in our heart, let me say that. If moron comes out of our mouth, it's because of this anger problem in the heart that we talked about last week. So today we enter into the second. These are actually, I'm going to change what I said last week. These are 5 case studies, and I'll explain why in just a moment. But we're going to enter into the second case study of what Jesus tells us it looks like to live right by one another in the kingdom of heaven, and thus have a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Our text this morning, our main text, is verse 27. If you'd look with me there, we'll read down to verse 32, and then we'll work on it with the help of the Holy Spirit together this morning. Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. You have heard that it was said, that's the way these case studies start. You've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Verse 29, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. This is our text this morning. And some commentators would say that you've heard that it's been said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that that's one case study. And then some commentaries would say that you have heard of old that you shouldn't divorce, and that's a separate one. I'm going to go with these are the same case study, which means we would then have 5 case studies and not 6. And I hope to show you why I think these two should be linked. It's actually a pretty big deal that we would link them together, I think. So we've got the second of 5 case studies. Now, before I get into dissecting the text, before we do together this morning, this is really important. I just want to give you a list of 4 things that Jesus is not saying in this part of Scripture. It's really important that you, this has been a hard message for me to prepare because I was trying to impose too much on the text. And it's like, well, Jesus isn't actually saying that in the text. So here's 4 things Jesus is not saying, and then we'll go look at what he is saying in the text, all right? So here they are. You can make notes of them, or you can just kind of tuck it away in your mind. In this case study, Jesus is not addressing the sexual desire of single people. See, here's the thing about case studies. They're examples, but not exhaustive. So Jesus is giving us an example of what righteousness that exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees in the matter of married men's sexual desire. He's giving us an example of that, but they're examples, but they're not exhaustive. So Jesus is not in this text talking about the sexual desire of single people. Would you lean in for just a moment? It's not because he doesn't have anything to say about that, and it's not because he doesn't care about that. He's just giving a case study on the sexual desire of men, of married men specifically. So he's not broadly addressing sexual desire. He's specifically addressing the sexual desire of married men. Amen. This is going to be hard plowing this morning. I can tell it already, man. Merry Christmas. This is also Jesus not giving his full teaching on divorce. There are other scriptures that would be important if the matter at hand was the biblical teaching on divorce. We'd have to look at a lot more. We will look at one other but this isn't all of Jesus' teaching on divorce. Number 3, Jesus is not condemning sexual desire. We get to the end of the message, you'll see he is for sexual desire rightly directed, all right? It's his plan. It's his good plan. Amen. He is not promoting self-harm. That weird part about cut off your hand and pull out your eyeball, like, what are you talking about, Jesus? Like, you probably should have consulted your PR team on that one. It's like, I hope I can kind of shed some, not because don't take that as like, oh, I've got this figured out. It's just like when you really study and you slow down. See, here's what I want to get at. Here's what I want to get at. A cursory reading of the text, like if we were just kind of like, oh, Matthew chapter 5, like a really careless reading of the text might lead us to make these assumptions. But we're not interested in a cursory reading of the text. We're trying to do, by the grace of God, what we teach our Awana kids to do. Right? We're trying to study so that we might rightly divide the word of truth. Now, that list of 4 things that I just gave you that Jesus is not doing, so he's not addressing the sexual desire of single people. He's not condemning sexual desire. He's not promoting self-harm. What was the 4th one? It's not his full teaching on divorce. There was a second one. Yeah, it's not his full teaching on divorce. Listen, all of those things would be great to talk about in grace groups this week. That's why grace groups are so vital, because I can't give you everything that I would want to give you, or we'd be here until like 4 o'clock or something like that. But it doesn't mean those things aren't important, and it doesn't mean the Bible can't help us understand those things further. Some of the questions that I tried to put together this week can help in those conversations, but we're addressing what does it mean for a married man to do right by others? Let me start over. What does it mean for a married man in the kingdom of heaven? What does it mean for him to do right by others in the matter of sexual desire? That's it. Like, that's the case study. What does that look like? And so let's see if we can figure that out together this morning. If you're making notes on the outline that we provided for you on the way in, number 1 in my outline is this one's pretty easy: forbidden actions. Forbidden actions. So verse 27 again. You have heard that it has been said, you shall not commit adultery. By the way, this, like the one before, don't murder, this is part of God's law, recorded for us in 2 different passages: Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 18. God says, do not commit adultery. But Jesus says, in the kingdom of heaven, we're developing the fullest expression of that law. And so Jesus says a fuller expression of the law, do not commit adultery, it's not just that I'm not physically committing adultery. Jesus said a fuller expression of that law, or the fulfillment of that law, would be that men in the kingdom don't look at women who aren't their wives in lustful ways, because Jesus says, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So it's not, I didn't commit the act. Jesus said, no, kingdom of heaven righteousness exceeds that. I don't have sinful desires. I'm going to have the Spirit of God work in me to root out sinful desires toward women that aren't my wife, because we're not stopping with I didn't do the act. Now, this is a big deal. I wish I would have said this last week. what Jesus is doing here is it's not as if Jesus comes along and he's like, you know the law that we got, like the Godhead, you know the law that we gave Moses on the mountain? We forgot a few parts, and that's not what Jesus is doing here. Okay? As a matter of fact, keep this one in your mind. If a man looks at a woman to lust after her, he's committed adultery already in his heart. The last of the 10 Commandments says this. The last of the 10 Commandments says, don't covet a woman who's not your wife. So one of the 10 Commandments is don't commit adultery, but the last 10 Commandment gets to the heart issue. So it's not that the law didn't get to the heart issue. Jesus is not coming along and saying, we forgot part of it and here's a little bit more. No, here's what Jesus is doing. What Jesus is doing is he's saying, the religious leaders have taken the law and they've applied it in unintended ways. So it's all messed up. That's what he means when he says, you've heard that it's been said. All of the teachers that you've been listening to have taken the law that I gave Moses. They've taken the law and they're applying it in ways that I never intended it to be applied. Essentially, what the scribes and Pharisees were doing with the law is they were so rigorously figuring out ways that they could state the law so that they would not violate the law, but they're doing it in ways that their hearts are unchanged. Which is why I think the divorce issue that Jesus deals with is part of the same case study. Because in the divorce issue, we see very clearly how the scribes and Pharisees said, okay, so we're not supposed to commit adultery. What could we do to not commit adultery, but kind of get around committing adultery? And when you look at how they handle the divorce issue, it's really, so let's do that for just a minute, okay? We're talking about forbidden actions. Verse number 31 is where the divorce issue, Jesus says, it's been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Jesus expounds on this in Matthew 19. So let's just jump over there very quickly and then we'll come back. Are you still with me? All right. I should have preached something about jingle bells this morning or something more Christmassy. Matthew chapter 19, Jesus has the conversation. The Pharisees come to him, testing him, and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Will you finish the sentence out loud with me? For just any reason. I highlighted that on purpose, and we'll come back to it and talk about why. Jesus answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them, you need this phrase too, this phrase comes up many times. Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason shall man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So Jesus says, let's go back to the creation account to see what God's plan is. We go back to the creation account and we find that God's plan is one man leaving his mother and father and one woman leaving his mother and father, and they come together in a covenant marriage that's consummated through the physical act of sexual intimacy, and they are covenant partners for life. And what God has joined together, let not man separate. Well, the Pharisees kind of rubbed them the wrong way, so they asked the question, well, time out, Jesus. Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? Jesus said, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, there's our phrase again, from the beginning, it was not so. Now, I'm going to stop for just a moment and say this, and then we're dealing with what Jesus... Divorce is not the unpardonable sin. Like there is grace and there is forgiveness and there are right reasons for marriages to end. But the issue going on in Jesus' day, remember the phrase I had you read out loud? The issue going on in Jesus' day is that the religious leaders, they didn't want to violate the law of do not commit adultery, so here's what they did. They said, we'll come up with ways in which we can divorce our wives for just any reason, so that if we see some pretty little new thing walking down the road and we desire her, all we have to do is file for a divorce for just any reason, and then we can go chase after her. So there were two schools, come to my mind, rabbinical schools. There were two schools led by rabbis during Jesus' day. One was the school of Shammai, and he was a rabbi who taught really what Jesus is teaching here. Divorce except for sexual sin is wrong. And then the school of Hillel, they promoted this idea of divorce for any reason. And theologians say, not surprisingly, by the way, theologians say that the teaching of the school of Hillel is the one that really caught on. Listen to this list. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's an example of reasons why the school of Hillel taught that men could divorce their wives. Ready? Epilepsy, tetanus, warts. Recorded. This is recorded. I don't even know what this next one means. If she had a wedge-shaped head, if she had a turnip-shaped head, if she had a hammer-shaped head, if she had bad posture, thinning hair, no eyebrows, one eyebrow, or bushy eyebrows, if her nose was too big, if her nose was too little, if her ears were too little, if her ears were too floppy, if she had a protruding navel, if she had bony ankles, if she was ambidextrous, if her parents moved in the same city as the husband and wife without his permission, he could divorce his wife. They didn't ask if they could come. If she burned his supper, don't say yes too loud. Easy. If he found someone prettier. That's not an exhaustive list, but it is a list of written down things for which. But do you see what's going on? We're not adulterers. We've just given ourselves every reason in the world why we could leave the wife we vowed to spend our life with and chase after some pretty little new thing. But we're not adulterers. Hey, by the way, would you pay close attention to something? I use the word pretty little thing, not because I think ladies are things, but because essentially that's, boy, this is so huge. That's exactly what lust does. Lust takes because we're dealing, now granted, there's lust in the hearts of men, and there's lust in the hearts of women, and there's lust in the hearts of singles, but we're talking about lust in the hearts of married men. Lust in the hearts of married men takes a daughter of God created in His image and reduces her to the value of like a shiny motorcycle or a new pair of Air Jordan, like the same. And I thought about that this week, and I thought, well, it's no wonder why we say, I love my wife and I love Chevys. It's no wonder why we use the same language, because we're not careful enough to think that she's not like a Chevy. Yeah. And brothers, this is like my heart for us, and I'm here to tell you this will help us. we who are in the kingdom of heaven, we have to like drum into our hearts and drum into our minds. She is not an object, and I will not objectify her. She is not an object, and I will not objectify. Guys, just say that with me one time. She is not an object, and I will not objectify her. Because if all we do is reduce the woman, the daughter of God, created in the image of God, if all we do, and it's married, single women, doesn't matter who it is, if all we do is reduce her to the value of a shiny new motorcycle or a brand new pair of sneakers, what we know what happens when the motorcycle is not shiny anymore. What happens when the sneakers aren't new anymore? And that's exactly what the scribes and Pharisees are doing. They're like, we're not adulterers. Your belly button sticks out too far. No, the big idea in the kingdom of heaven. And by the way, it's something that drastically separates the kingdom of heaven from the kingdoms of this earth. The big idea in the kingdom of heaven is that women are of infinitely more value than an object. They're image bearers of God. And so Jesus says, the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees is content with not getting into bed with a woman who's not your wife. Jesus says righteousness that exceeds that and is the kind of righteousness that those in the kingdom of heaven have. That kind of righteousness says, I'm not going to do that, and God, root out of my heart lust, which is adultery of the heart. Forbidden actions. Write down a second thing. Number two, Jesus then goes on to really lay down the gauntlet, and he's like, hey, I want you to take fierce aim at this desire, this sinful desire of lust. I want you to fiercely get after rooting this thing out. Look at verse 29. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. These two verses were the hardest part of the sermon for me, and I struggled with it until like Friday, and Friday when Rach and I were driving home from school, man, the Lord just unlocked something in my mind, and I was like, Lord, I think I get it. This is the section, if you remember the four things Jesus is not saying, this is the section where I would make sure that you understand Jesus is not promoting self-harm. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, bro, it sure sounds like it. The reason that this was so hard for me this week is because last week, if you remember last week, don't murder, that's prohibitive law. And Jesus says, don't have unjust anger and don't call your brother a fool and don't call your brother a moron. That's prohibitive law. But then he goes on to say, if you bring your gift to the altar and remember at the altar that your brother has aught against you, go, and that's proactive love. And that was so easy for me to see. It's like, oh, righteousness that exceeds isn't all about, well, we don't. Righteousness that exceeds is we do. So yeah, we don't murder, and we don't call people morons, and we don't call people fools, and we don't have unjust anger. We don't do those things, but righteousness that exceeds is we do seek reconciliation at every opportunity. And even if the opportunity is not there, we go make the opportunity, right? So it's so easy to see in that instance. Here's what the text feels like in this instance. Prohibitive law is, don't commit adultery. God, by your grace, we won't do that. And by your grace and the power of your Spirit, we're not even going to commit adultery in our hearts. We're going to put to death this thing of prohibitive law. What is proactive love? It sounds like Jesus is saying, if you want to have righteousness that exceeds you, proactively love people by cutting off your hands and pulling out your eyes. Now, what Jesus is really doing here, and I can prove, hey, take my word, I can prove this to you from the text. What Jesus is really doing here is he's going for shock value. Although there is some truth in it. Here's the truth. It would be better for you to enter into heaven with no limbs, right? I mean, you just start sawing everything, all right? You just kind of, however that works, right? You'd probably just have to roll, wouldn't you? You just have to roll, because I'm hopping with legs. So it would be better for you, that was bad. Because some people don't, I get it. It would be better for you to have someone roll you into the gates of heaven than to go to hell with all your body parts. Yeah. So that's true, but let me show you why Jesus is. We're not unfamiliar with this. Think about this. Will a mind that's filled with sensuality be purified through blindness or injury? This is kind of a crude example, but it makes sense. Like if you've been involved in pornography and you close your eyes, it's not like all of us, right? Because that's blindness. I can't see anything. So if the mind has been saturated with sensual things and the person goes blind, it's not solving the issue, right? Here's another reason Jesus isn't saying the way that you proactively love in the kingdom is self-harm. Paul says in Romans chapter number 6, verse number 13, Paul says, do not present your members, your body parts, as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. In other words, Paul doesn't say sever, he says sanctify. So first of all, pulling out your eyeballs and cutting off your hands ain't solving the problem anyways. Sorry for the language there. And secondly, Paul and Jesus would be disagreeing if Jesus was being serious about this. Paul doesn't say start cutting stuff off. He says sanctify, set apart your eyeballs and your hands and your feet and your ears and your mouth. Set it apart to the service of God. The third reason I would submit to you that Jesus is not being literal but going for shock value is because one of the big things we've been talking about in this whole series, one of the big things we've been talking about is that the call of God for our lives is to join Him in bringing goodness, beauty, and order into the world. Now, I want to be very careful how I say this because blind people can bring goodness, beauty, and order into the world, and paraplegics can bring beauty and goodness and order. So I'm not saying there's no ability to do that. I'm just saying, like, if we have properly functioning bodies, it is of great advantage to us in attempting to bring goodness and order and beauty into the world. So Jesus would literally be disrupting the thing for which He created us if He was saying, pull out your eyeballs, cut off your arms. And look, you and I, we're not unfamiliar with this kind of, it sounds weird in the context of sexual temptation, but we're not unfamiliar. If I were to say to read man, you better get to church on time tomorrow. Our staff meeting is at 9:30, and you better, I don't care if you have to sleep in the church. There are a lot of other things he could do than sleep in the church. Like he could set an alarm and put his clothes out the night before and take a shower and have his wife set an alarm. And, there are a lot of, but the shock value is, I don't care what it takes. You make sure this, that's what Jesus is doing here. He's saying, whatever it takes, which I think brings to the surface the question of, well, what would it take for married men to stop lusting after women who aren't their wives? Jesus helps us with this in a considerable way if we're carefully paying attention to the text. Go back to Matthew chapter number 5, verse number 28. I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And if you remember the conversation in Matthew chapter number 19, Jesus said it was because of the hardness of their hearts that Moses gave them the permission to divorce as long as they signed a certificate. At least one thing it would take for married men to stop lusting after women who aren't their wives, at least one thing it would take is a new heart. Don't run by that. It's kind of the big deal. At least one thing it would take would be a new heart. Matter of fact, someone has said that as you study the Sermon on the Mount, you keep being confronted by this reality. The heart of the matter is the matter of the heart. But I have good news this morning. I have good news. The new covenant is all about how God extends to us the offer of a brand new heart. Ezekiel chapter number 11, verse number 19, I will give them one heart, I will put a new spirit within them, and will take the stony heart out of their flesh and give them a heart of flesh, that they may, he's going to give us a new heart for the purpose of walking in his statutes and keeping his judgments so that they can do them. They shall be my people. I will be their God. Listen to me, before you go pulling out eyes and cutting off hands. I said that the wrong way. I should have said it like this. Before we, because I'm rowing in the same boat, before we go cutting off hands and pulling out eyes, let's make sure we've received a new heart. And if you're here going, what is that even, how does a person, this is such a great passage that answers that. It's by grace that you are saved through faith, not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Man, if you're in the room and you're like, my righteousness doesn't even exceed the righteousness of, I have committed adultery and I'm struggling, and lust just reigns and rules in my life, then this is the good news of the gospel for sinners like you and me, that Jesus didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And we can come with all of our lust and with all of our messed up past and with all of our broken relationships, and we can come to the foot of the cross and we can say, Jesus, just look at me. I don't have anything to bring you, but if you'll give me a new heart, I'll give you all of my sin and I'll receive your righteousness by faith. This is proactive part number one. Proactive part number one is receive a new heart from God by faith in Jesus Christ. But this was another reason. I'm not complaining. I love hard messages because they make me study a lot. But this was the other reason that this seemed like such a hard text, because I kept wrestling with, I've been telling our church family, this is about how we live in the kingdom, not get in the kingdom. This is about how we live in the kingdom. And the kingdom is not content with prohibitive laws, but pursues proactive love. And so Jesus, it can't just be get saved. You're talking to your disciples. You're talking to people who've already trusted you. So what does proactive love look like for married men who want to have righteousness that exceeds the righteous? What are you teaching us about how married men in the kingdom of heaven can do right by others with regard to sexual desire? I'll write down a third thing and then we're done. Probably 10 minutes and we'll be done. Number 3, fixed affections. Fixed affections. This is again why I think don't commit adultery and don't divorce for any cause except sexual immorality. What I'm about to show you is why I think they're one and the same case study and not two separate ones. So Jesus says, you've heard that it has been said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, if a man looks at a woman to lust after her, he's committed adultery with her already in his heart. And then in verse 31, furthermore, it's been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give a certificate of divorce. You guys are content with that. Just not you guys, the scribes and Pharisees. You're not. And then some of you are like, no, hang on. No, I'm not. The scribes and Pharisees are content with a certificate. And Jesus says, not in the kingdom of heaven. In the kingdom of heaven, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. See if this makes sense. I've worked hard on this, all right? Lord, help it make sense. I think what Jesus is doing by attaching this issue to the lust issue, because of what the scribes, what were the scribes and Pharisees doing? Oh, we're not adulterers. Woo! See you later. You know, that's what the scribes and Pharisees were doing. And Jesus comes along and he says, don't do that. Don't do that. This is the way that it clicked in my mind. Don't find every reason to divorce so you can chase after every pretty woman your flesh wants to objectify. That's kingdom of the world righteousness. Don't do that. Don't find every reason to divorce. Find every reason to stay married. Now, wait a minute. I've got a little bit more. Because I've been around far too many Christian couples who the only reason they are married is because they don't believe in divorce. And I don't think that's what Jesus, I don't think that's where he wants us to stop. No. Instead of finding every reason to divorce, find every reason to stay married and madly in love with the woman to whom you vowed before God that you would cherish and treasure. The good news of the kingdom is not receive a new heart and then try really hard not to lust. The good news of the kingdom for married men is receive a new heart, and with that new heart, love, treasure, desire, and pursue the woman that you made a vow with before God and witnesses. That's proactive. I didn't commit adultery. Yeah, but when's the last time you told her how hot she is? I'm just trying to help us this morning, you know what I'm saying? When's the last time you walked into the kitchen and just laid one on her? Because if we're not doing that, we're just doing, well, I'm not sleeping around. I find every other woman to be sexually enticing to me, and I just kind of, she'll make my meals or what. I told her I loved her at the altar. Oh my goodness. Do you really think that's what Jesus meant when he said, dwell with him according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker? Do you really think weaker in the sense of precious, not no strength, just like that fine and beautiful vessel that God, no. Proactive says, yeah, God, by your grace, I'm not going to commit adultery, and God, by your grace, I'm not going to lust after a woman that's not my wife, and God, by your grace, I'm gonna get after her. I want to say something to the ladies, but I don't. It's kind of weird, and I don't want to be crude, but don't repel his advances. Amen. oh, I could say this later because the Bible will give me permission to. So I'll wait until a minute later and then I'll say it, okay? But once I got a hold of, the divorce issue is the proactive part. Don't find every reason to divorce. Find every reason to stay married and madly in love with the wife that you vowed before God and witnesses that you would treasure, cherish, and desire. Once I got that, the whole Bible just started going poof, poof, poof. So watch this. Proverbs chapter number 5, verse number 18. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth as a loving deer and a graceful doe. Let her breast satisfy you at all times and always be enraptured with her love. 1 Corinthians chapter number 7. Now concerning the things of which I wrote to you, concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let every man have his own wife and let every woman have her own husband. And let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. And by the way, the language of the Bible is it's not like, I love you, honey. It's sexual love is what's being talked about here. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And all of the men would have been like, yes, that's right. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. If you'll stop and think about this, because I had never thought about it till I was preparing the message, that last part would have been absolutely absurd in Jesus' day. That last part about the husband doesn't have authority over his, because I have to talk to my freshman Bible class about this a lot. I hate that it is true that in Bible times women were property. I hate that, but it's true, right? So Jesus speaks into this culture where like you gave your daughter so you could get some land, it's something silly like. Jesus speaks into that culture and he goes, the wife's body is no longer her own. And all the men were like, were you listening? Write that down, make a note. And Jesus says, the husband doesn't have authority over his. And all the women would have been like, what? I used to read this and I read it the wrong way because my heart's been warped improperly in areas of sexual desire. And God, by his grace, is helping, rooting, and sanctifying. And I have brothers that come alongside of me and a wife that has walked a hard road with me. And we're still walking that road together. I used to read this like this. That's right. If I want it, I get it. Right? That's why I told your kids to go to Grace Kids, okay? I'm just telling you. This is not, it's different than that. My role in this is not to demand from her what I want. My role in this is to give up my. Do you see the flip in that? I was coming at it from my, and no. See, this is where it's proactive love. Proactive love is I'm giving myself up. I'm giving myself up. I'm not demanding of her. I'm giving myself up in love. And that's what I was saying earlier, ladies. Now look, see, this is why grace groups are so important. Sexual sin, it's in a category all its own with the harm that it does. The Bible actually talks about that. It's in a category all its own. So if counseling is needed for sex in your marriage, if you are married, if it's needed for it to be the good gift that God, then get counseling and get help and sometimes physical. I'm aware of a lot of that stuff, probably not all of it, but I'm aware of a lot of that. But if all things being considered are relatively equal and your healthy, functioning husband and wife, don't repel his advances. Yes, I'll preach at him and us men all day long. Love her in other ways than that. Man, I will harp on that. I will harp on that. But he might be in that action of putting his sexual desire on you. He might be going to war against lust. He is. It's not a might be thing. He's going to war against lust in his own heart. He's saying, no. This is the woman. I desire her. And this 1 Corinthians passage goes on to say, when we keep saying, oh, my head hurts. Oh, is this the kids? When we keep saying, I'm talking to, see, this is why I didn't want to go here, because I knew I'd get in trouble. When ladies keep repelling that, 1 Corinthians goes on to say, are you really surprised when he goes? Not that he should. It's not an excuse. It's not an excuse. But don't repel his advances of trying to put all of his sexual desire on you. He's got a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees because he's a citizen in the kingdom of heaven. And he's trying to figure out as a man how to do right by others with his sexual desire. Remember that phrase that I kept telling you about? But from the beginning? Jesus said that. Genesis chapter 2, verse 25. From the beginning, they were naked, the man and his wife. They weren't ashamed. What does proactive love in the kingdom of heaven for married men look like in the area of sexual desire? I would say it looks like cherish, honor, serve the woman that I took a vow before God and witnesses to. I would say it's cherish, honor, desire, serve her, and direct all of my sexual desire toward her. That's what it looks like. And then the Bible gives us a few more instructions that might be helpful. Don't make provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. So I'm going to proactively love her in many other ways than sex, but with my sexual desire, expressing love to her. I'm going to proactively love her, and I'm not going to... I talked to a brother recently about this. He came to me and he said, hey, I've had this struggle, and he said, you've been pretty open about it, and what are some things that have helped along the way? And so I said, A, talk to your wife about it. Tell her about your sin. Come clean. B, get some software on your technological devices that monitors what sites you look at. So, oh, that's legalist. No, it's not legalist. It's a man desiring to have a righteousness that says, well, at least I didn't sleep. A righteousness that exceeds that. So I'm proactively loving, cherishing, desiring in many ways, and also with sexual desire, while not making provision for the flesh because I've received a new heart. And then asking God, with this new heart that you've given me, toward women who aren't my wife, would you help me to follow Paul's instructions to Timothy? Here's what Paul told Timothy under the inspiration of God. Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger as sisters, with all purity. If she's not your wife, here's what she is to you. She's a mother or a sister. Do you know what that rules out? That rules out her being an object over which we fantasize. This is righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees.